Good morning, afternoon, and evening, and welcome to everyone. Global Insights is a live interactive panel discussion which sheds light on big issues currently facing policymakers, researchers, and planners worldwide. Global Insights features experts from leading institutions in the study of international affairs, including the Balsillie School in Canada, Warwick University in the UK, the American University in Washington, DC, ISA in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, Konstanz University in Germany, and the Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, Japan. Today's live stream discussion is entitled The Future of Work in a Post-COVID World. My name is Anne Fitzgerald. I'm the director of the Balsillie School, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's session. A warm welcome to all participants in the audience today. We would invite you to direct any questions you may have for the panelists using the Q&A function on your Zoom panel, and we will direct those to the appropriate panelists, particularly towards the latter part of today's session. Before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement and acknowledge the land on which the Balsillie School, as host of today's session, is situated. Acknowledging this land is the process of deliberately naming that this land is Indigenous land, and Indigenous people have the rights to this land. So the Balsillie School is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations, which is on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. It is particularly important that the school recognizes the land on which it's situated in all it does, including Global Insights. We're privileged today to host four well-known experts on issues related to the nature of work and employment. Joel Bildt is an associate professor of economics from the University of Waterloo and a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Joel has studied, among other things, the impact of technological automation on the future of jobs. He's advised the Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs on the intellectual property chapter of the North American Free Trade negotiations, the G7 Sherpas on artificial intelligence and robotics automation, and the Deputy Canadian Ministers on the future of work. Joel served on the advisory board of the Creative Destruction Lab, one of the preeminent Canadian accelerators for high-tech ventures. Tom Parr is an associate professor in political theory in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick. He is a Marie Curie Fellow in the Department of Law at the Université Pompeu Fabra. He has held positions at the University of Essex, Grasse University, and Princeton University. Toshiko Sugimoto joined the College of International Relations at Ritsumeikan University as associate professor in April 2020. Her research fields include Filipino labor migration to Asia, particularly South Korea, and Filipino overseas workers' global mobility, such as onward migration to Canada. Her research interest involves relationships between migrants and their families left behind and the socio-reproductive concerns of Filipino migrant workers. During his 40 years as a US diplomat, Earl Anthony Wayne served as a senior policymaker in Washington and overseas as an ambassador, last in Mexico. Since 2016, he's written and spoken on a wide range of issues, including Mexico, North America, trade and workforce development, and others. He teaches at American University's School of International Service and serves as co-chair of the advisory board of the Mexican Institute, overseeing a project on implementation of USMCA at the Wilson Center. So warm welcome to all the panelists today. Thank you for joining us. I want to kick off acknowledging that we're living in a slightly different world than we used to be, and ask you whether or not if it's fair to say that the pandemic has forced organizations, universities, companies, and government to rethink some basic assumptions about the way we do work. Joel, let's start with you. How is COVID-19 transforming our economy?
So I think the most obvious change that we've already seen is a move to remote work, right? So it's estimated that about 40% of jobs can be done remotely from home. And at the peak of the pandemic, that's roughly what we saw. About 40% of Canadian jobs were being done from home. But the other big change that's maybe less obvious right now that is really coming down the line is automation and reallocation. So there's going to be a permanent change in our economy. So we've been talking about AI and robotics for a long time. I think this is where we're actually going to see a massive shift and where they're really going to make an impact on our labor market. Now, why am I saying that? If you look back to the last 3 recessions, so basically all recessions since the beginning of the ICT revolution, there's been a massive drop in routine employment during those recessions. And we're going to see the exact, and by the way, those jobs never came back. And so we're going to see the same thing happening here, but to a larger scale. And the reason is that superimposed on top of the usual recessionary forces for automation reallocation, there's now going to be health incentives as well. So imagine that you're running a factory floor and you know a next wave is coming. What are you going to do? Well, you're going to make sure that you mitigate risk to your workers, to your operations by changing worker-worker interactions with worker-machine interactions, right? Or better yet, you get rid of workers altogether. Then there's no risk. And so the really big change that I see coming is a lot more automation of the economy.
Thanks, Joel. Well, on that note, Anthony, over to you. Is there any way to know how rapidly COVID has sped up the arrival of these new technologies in the workplace?
Well, we can just look at some of the statistics that are coming out as to use. For example, digital commerce was up about 18% in the first half of the year. There are a lot of signs that use of digital services are spreading across the economy. In the banking sector, entertainment, grocery, in groceries even, you see significant expansion of digital services. You also see that in the number of servers being sold. So there's more data that people are storing and using in those servers. A couple of polls of the various actors in the economy, Accenture found that 73% of the executives they queried said they were starting to use AI and moving ahead with plans to do that. The number of 85% of manufacturing CEOs said they foresaw increased investment in smart factories over the year ahead. And logistics firms were already, about half of them or more before the pandemic, adding more digital analytics, more automation, and we've just observed in the trade across North America that has increased during the pandemic. So there's a lot going on already, and we'll start seeing more signs of this as we collect more data.
Thank you. Toshiko, what is the impact of COVID on labor migration trends, particularly where you're speaking to us from at the moment in Asia?
Okay, so I would say that the pandemic's impact on international labor migration is yet to be calculated, but it can be tremendous, I say. According to the World Bank, the remittances to migrant sending country this year will decrease by 20% due to the downturn of global economy and the massive layoff of migrant workers. And experts say that the remittances decrease is an unprecedented level even compared to the global financial crisis in 2009, whose impact on labor migration was relatively small. So the pandemic impact and effect on labor migration in Asia is projected to be huge, as the region includes a major migrant sending country globally. And moreover, Asia has been a global center of the migrant destination country as well. And then Asian Development Bank forecasts that the countries in Asia, such as China, India, and the Philippines, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Vietnam, whose GDPs comprise of the significant shares of the remittances from abroad, are most likely to face severe economic condition. But I would like to highlight in the entire session today that pandemic's impact on international labor migration cannot be limited to the migrant workers and their home countries, but the crisis we face now is more likely to affect the migrant host countries and the social and economic order widely and deeply. So I will elaborate on it more later. Thanks.
Thank you. Tom, over to you. Tell us about the office these days. How important is the office as a social and economic institution?
Great, thanks. So offices fairly obviously benefit firms in a number of ways. They enable them to coordinate and monitor their staff, as well as provide a kind of venue for the informal interactions that oil healthy workplace relationships. But obviously it also benefit the workers as well. The kind of face-to-face social contact that we get with our colleagues can be valuable for a host of reasons. Most immediately, the environment can germinate meaningful friendships and healthy relationships, something that's even more important in an age where larger numbers than ever are reporting a sense of loneliness or social isolation. But beyond that, I suspect that we're more likely to trust our colleagues if we really know them, if they're more than just a face on a screen. And this kind of trust matters a lot, especially when we're negotiating contracts, if we're in collective bargaining, for example. So I'm not saying we should cling on to the old-fashioned model of working in the office 9 to 5. Many workers might welcome the option of working from home. But the point is, when we think about the office, we have to think open-mindedly about not only its economic benefits to employers, but the social and economic benefits to staff as well.
Thanks very much. Let's move to the theme that's being discussed at the moment in commentary, which is that this pandemic has hit some sectors harder than others. So Joel, in your view, what sectors have been most impacted? Who are the winners, who are the losers, or who might be the winners and the losers?
I think there's a couple of different questions here. One is which sectors have been most impacted so far? And the other one is which are going to be most impacted by the time that this COVID pandemic is over? And I have a paper on my website, if anyone's interested, that addresses both of those. I'm going to focus on the latter. On by the end of this, automation and reallocation is going to have affected which sectors the most. And so really what we need to think about is this is a health crisis at the end of the day. And we can ask, well, what sectors have the biggest incentives to automate? Well, it's going to be the sectors where there's the highest health risks, right? So that's where we really are trying to find new ways of doing things so that the health risks are lessened. But of course, not all sectors with strong health risks are automatable. We can automate feasibly. And so that's the second thing to consider is, well, what sectors can actually feasibly be automated? So what I did was I went and looked at a whole bunch of different tasks within different sectors and classified them as to whether they result in high health risk and whether they can be easily automated. And so the two sectors that came out as having lots of these types of tasks are the retail industry and accommodation and food services. So those are the two sectors where I think by far we're going to see the biggest change. That's where already we've seen the most change. And again, I could talk about that later. But I do want to point out one other thing is that there are certain sectors where traditionally we've seen no productivity or very little productivity increases, very little automation. But in this recession, because it is different and because of the health risks, we might actually see significant changes. And the two big ones there are health, so our health sector, and education. Those are two areas where the health risks are really high. And even though it's not obviously automatable, there's a lot of pressure there to find ways to automate. And that's what we're seeing as well.
Thank you. Fascinating. Toshiko, over to you. Tell us about the impact of more secure borders, closed borders, restrictions on mobility, and the impact on the migrant-dependent sectors.
Yes, well, generally speaking, the vast majority of migrant workers are employed in the service sector. So due to the lockdowns and a ban on travel in many countries, service sectors, including wholesale, retail, and food, tourism, and hospitality industry have severely damaged. Some migrant workers have been engaged in face-to-face service activities such as the staff in hotels, restaurants, cruise ships, and airports. And Asian Development Bank, or I will call ADB, reports that many countries have been depending on Asian migrant workers for their leisure and hospitality businesses before the pandemic. And the ADB showed that these Asian migrant workers are vulnerable to the layoffs, and most of them are informal workers without legal protection and social security. And they were dismissed from the work because of the decrease in travel and human mobility and the break in demand and supply chain after the lockdowns and the production suspension. On the other hand, employees' economic condition deteriorated by the COVID-19 had accelerated the unemployment of migrant domestic workers, such as in Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Middle East, and other parts of the world, of course. And so pandemics after effects, which directly, indirectly hit migrant workers and their employers are still unknown, but I think that its magnitude looks considerable.
Thank you, Tom Parr. I want to continue along this thread and just ask you how governments and employers will manage this trend towards more remote working without negatively impacting or worsening, in some cases, labor market inequalities, particularly between high and low skilled workers.
Right, so over the last few decades, we've seen staggering rises in economic inequality between high-skilled and low-skilled workers across the world. In many countries, most of Europe and North America, whereas the prospects of those with a college education have skyrocketed, the prospects of those without a college education have stagnated. Often, we've barely seen an improvement on half a century ago. Now, here I think the case of remote working or working from home provides a clear example. Now, this prospect is comparatively attractive if you're lucky enough to have a comfortable home, perhaps in a private office, reliable internet connection. But if you're in shared accommodation, as huge numbers of young people are in large cities around the world, then you'll probably encounter a full range of further obstacles, higher likelihood of distraction, slower internet speeds, for example. And this is going to render you much less productive than your colleagues. In turn, this is going to set back your likelihood of achieving promotion or the pay rises. So I think policymakers and governments need to take real care to make sure that those who are low skilled, who are less well equipped to deal with these changes, don't end up suffering the brunt of the burden.
Thanks for that. Tony, over to you. Your fellow panelists have just outlined a number of challenges that are impacting on employers in different sectors. Are there any countries that are ready for this?
Well, of course, until the test comes, we're not going to know for sure, but there are a number of different indexes that have tried to measure how ready countries are for automation, for innovation, where workers are thought to be the most skilled, which countries attract the most skilled immigrants. And so if you take all those indexes and look at them, you do get a cluster of countries that are consistently in the top 10. And they are Singapore, the United States, the UK, Sweden, Germany, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Now, they don't all perform equally well across the whole mix of indicators, but they have a lot of strengths. And so you would suspect that a number of these countries would be able to respond to the pandemic overall very well. That doesn't mean they'll all respond in taking care of the poor and underskilled that Tom was talking about, or the migrants that Toshiko was talking about. But overall, in dealing with the pandemic, you could expect some of these countries are going to come out as the best performers in the end, if not in the immediate term.
Thank you. So the pandemic has shone a light on many pre-existing inequalities in our societies, as well as the precariousness of employment for many citizens and migrant workforce. So Tom, I would like to put a question to you and ask you if we should allow the market to determine workers' exposure to COVID health risks.
Right, so unless we're very careful, we should expect to see the emergence of a world in which individuals' access to economic resources really strongly predicts their exposure to the health risks of COVID. Indeed, I think this is already happening. Those higher up the income distribution are somewhat protected from the worst risks by the luxuries of being able to work from home, or having groceries delivered to your doorstep, or nice gardens in which to relax. They might even have savings on which they can rely in case they need to take time away from work. By contrast, those lower down the income distribution rarely enjoy such opportunities. For many cleaners, for example, the option of staying at home to protect one's health, or the health of one's loved ones, is simply not affordable, at least if you're going to make ends meet. Now, the same is true for nurses, care workers, delivery drivers. Given the scale and the severity of the pandemic, no doubt we should expect everyone, rich and poor, to bear some additional burdens. But it's profoundly unjust when these burdens fall disproportionately on society's least advantaged members. We must find ways of sharing these burdens more fairly.
Thanks, Tom. Toshiko, one thing we haven't heard a lot about over here, was some commentary on the impact or the challenges both migrant sending and host countries face right now after the closure of borders in Asia. Can you shed some light on that?
Okay, sure. Although the worldwide scale of migrant worker itself is very tiny, but the international labor migration has played a critical role in the global society, as we know, to ensure sustainability, welfare, and security. And after the closure of borders, agriculture and other essential service sector in the migrant host countries suffer from the shortage of labor. For example, in metropolitan Tokyo, 24 hours open convenience stores were mostly operated by international student come migrant workers before the COVID situation. So due to international students' entry restriction from the last March, Japanese owners of the convenience store encountered great difficulty filling the void of migrant employees. And unemployed native workers provisionally replaced the void of migrant employees, but the Japanese shop owners still prefer young migrant workers to native employees. So last June, the special committee of the ruling party, Liberal Democratic Party in Japan, recommended including the convenience stores in labor-hungry sector and adopting new immigration schemes for shop owners to employ migrant owners full-time. On the other hand, migrant sending countries also face numerous challenges to adapt themselves to the new world order that took away the primary sources of their livelihood they have depended on, for example, as the leading migrant sending country in the world. The Philippines is characterized by a consumer-driven economy, and the foreign remittances of migrant workers account for roughly 10% of the GDP. But the decrease in remittances in the Philippines this year is estimated to exacerbate the shrinking domestic consumption and difficulty of migrant family for the loss of the sole lifeline, which is remittances. And domestic job creation for repatriated migrant workers takes a long time, and the Philippines remittance-oriented economy cannot change overnight. So I can say that both migrant sending and receiving countries suffer from a sudden and tremendous change in the world economy for the past half year without appropriate preparation. Both sides cannot find an alternative to address the interrupted supply and demand chain beyond international labor migration.
Thanks so much. Joel Blitt, what are your views on how this will change our society?
Well, if we're talking about automation and reallocation, then the obvious first order impact is loss of jobs, right? And so we need to worry about what's going to happen, at least in the short run, if a lot of these jobs are disappearing because the economy is in a recession, but also because these jobs may not come back very quickly if they get automated or if they get reallocated from less productive to more productive firms that are using fewer workers, right? So that's the first order concern. Now, the funny thing is that's not the big thing I'm concerned about. The big thing I'm concerned about is something even bigger because it's going to be permanent, which is the impact it's going to have on inequality. And so if you just look back at the last 30, 40 years, so basically since the beginning of the ICT revolution, we've seen a process called job polarization, right? So we've seen job polarization. What that means is that the jobs that are towards the middle of the skill distribution have been disappearing. Okay, so these might be bookkeepers in offices, office support workers, it might be manufacturing workers, etc. Those jobs have been disappearing, and the people that used to have those jobs have mostly had to find jobs in services that tend to pay less. As a result, there's been this polarization where you've got the higher end white collar workers that are making a lot of money, whose skills are complementary to these technologies, the ICT technologies, and therefore they're more productive. And then you have workers in services that are making much less. Now, what are we going to see with AI, with robotics? I think the story is going to be more complicated because, as we know, AI can replace some white collar workers as well. So it is going to be a bit different than what we've seen in the past. But fundamentally, it'll be the same kinds of dynamics where if you have the types of skills that are complementary to AI, you're going to see an increase in your productivity. If you have the types of skills that are substitutes with AI, you're going to see your possibilities for work suffer and probably end up making a lot less. And so my biggest concern with these new technologies is that it's going to increase inequality in the long run.
Okay. Tony, along that line, have we seen any promising responses so far? And if so, where are they emerging from?
I would say no, I have not seen any standout promising responses so far. I would say in the short run, those countries that were already investing a substantial amount in their labor market are taking care of people in the short term, but they're not necessarily the same places that have good programs to deal with what Joel was just talking about, re-educating people, retraining them, upskilling them, bringing people back to the jobs that will be there. So what you really need to see is a public-private, federal, sub-federal, academic dialogue developing to redirect training to the needs of the industries in each area, and then have an ability at a national level or a higher level, and even internationally in certain regions that produce together, to talk about what kind of skills are needed. How do we build those skills? That's going to take a lot of reinvention. You can start doing that now because very fortunately, there are some regions in every part of the world that are already doing that. There are some great dialogues between companies, academic institutions, and governments that move in the right direction. But those were already existing. Don't know yet. I honestly don't know how well they're responding right now, but that's the kind of model we need to, all of us, I think, put a lot more of investment into.
Thank you. Tom Parr, governments clearly have a big role to play in this pandemic recovery and response with regards to how the labor market moves forward. But it's probably safe to assume that things are not going to return to business as usual, even for the longer term. So how can governments and employers ensure that this response does not worsen the existing labor market inequalities between men and women?
Yeah, so this is a tricky one. We can't be sure, but one area that we might see some interesting changes is with respect to the gender division of labour and the resulting gender pay gap. So on the one hand, I'd like to think that as fathers spend more time working from home, some of them will gain a new appreciation for the domestic labour and childcare that's disproportionately performed by women and mothers. We might even hope that beyond the appreciation, some of these fathers might even share in this work more fairly, at least in the long run. So a couple of years ago, the Trade Union Congress in the United Kingdom reported that about half of young fathers believed that their job was preventing them from spending as much time as they'd like with their children. Now, if the pandemic brings about more flexible forms of employment, including working from home, then fathers will enjoy the opportunities that they say they've been craving. If this happens, then we'll learn whether these men really do want to see change or whether this is just cheap talk.
Tony, what are the good models in this area, and who are the best players who can help us find success?
Well, I think there are a number of these local and regional models that have been very successful. And there are a number of companies that they tend to be larger companies. They have a model that when they go invest in a new area, they look to train their workers. They look to work with the local universities or community colleges. They help identify a curriculum of what they need in that area. They work with the government, and they come up with a partnership to move ahead. And I won't mention any particular companies, so I'm not endorsing anybody. There are a number of European origin that have this as a very primary motivation. There are some from Japan also that are famous for doing this. And there are some American companies that have developed these systems. But when that works and the companies take the lead and they have local partners, you do see good jobs emerging. And that gives you the kind of stability that can really bolster a region. Now, this is responding in part to the angst that happened in the first 15 years of this century when a lot of manufacturing and other jobs disappeared. And so in the absence of good national policies, at least in North America, responding to that, you came up with these local models. And even in a relatively poor country like Mexico, there's a model in Querétaro, another model in Puebla, where this cooperation has actually produced good new jobs in a country that does not have a strong national framework for education and workforce training. So this is very possible. But as I said earlier, it's got to be reinvented and reimagined now and expanded on a much larger scale than we've seen before, because the pandemic is pushing this inequality forward. Just to mention, I will give a plug to the Washington Post today. There's a wonderful article on the inequality of this with a lot of graphics, and you can go in there and just see the different receptions and the effect on inequality in the US economy.
Thank you. Toshiko, how does all this bode for the future of international labor markets and migration?
Yes, this is a very difficult question, but the international migration can institutionally and dramatically change in the post-COVID situation. Suppose second and third recurrent waves of the pandemic, immigration can involve more complex and bureaucratic process, such as imposing a certain quarantine period upon arrival of new entrants. So gaining migrant workforce timely and securely can be challenging for employers than ever. But the problem is that many countries are still in need of migrant workers. As migrant workers in health, agriculture, and fishery sector, the demand for elderly care is very acute at the background of the super aging and population declining society in Asia. While the migrant labor flows might slow down for the years to come and some migrant-dependent sector decay, the significance in essential sector will be intact and even bringing about further competition among over migrant workers among host countries. So despite the technology advancement and heightened productivity and automation in some industry, migrant workers seem to be continuously sought after by care for small-scale farming and fishery sector that are hard to mechanize due to particular cost and environmental constraints. And another important aspect we need to heed is the changing labor migration patterns in response to the proliferation of work arrangements such as teleworking. And suppose that migrant domestic workers, employers are working from home and the time spending with their families expand. So in that case, the duties and demand for migrant domestic workers may undergo some changes.
Thank you. Joel, you shared lots of examples of automation, the use of virtual remoteness in different ways. Let me sort of turn this argument over and say, should governments either stop or slow down some of these transformations?
Well, it's tempting to think that the solution might be, hey, let's slow this down. First of all, I don't think it's even possible, even if we tried. And secondly, we have to recognize that this transformation, this automation reallocation, this is going to be good in the long run. This is going to make us richer. It's going to increase the standard of living. And so it's not, I would say the exact opposite. Let's try and encourage this as much as we can. And so how can we encourage this transformation? Well, first of all, we have to get rid of policies that are actively stifling it. And to me, the really big one is wage subsidies. So the wage subsidies that we used to have implemented up until, so we've not reformed it, but we were on track to spend $300,000 a year per job that was saved by these wage subsidies. Surely that is not a good investment if for every job that you save, you're spending $300,000 a year. But, so this is in Canada, but the figures for the US were actually very similar, is in the mid 200,000s, low 200,000s. The second reason why wage subsidies are not a good idea is now we've reformed the system. And as a result of the reforms, there's now a disincentive for firms to invest and increase revenues. Because for every dollar of revenue that they increase, they now get 48 cents less in these subsidies. So if you're a firm, you're not going to want to grow, you're not going to invest, which is exactly what we want them to do when these wage subsidies are actually giving you the inverse incentives. And thirdly, if you're subsidizing labor, if you're making it have too low a price, then you're stunning the incentives to automate and also stopping the reallocation process because it's a subsidy to firms. And so I really think these need to be phased out sooner rather than later. So we should be supporting workers, not firms, through these subsidies. Now, so what should we be doing proactively? We should also be investing in technology. A lot of our firms right now are struggling financially, they're financially constrained. And so we need to help them make those investments in technology for the future. We also, a lot of our firms also don't know how to work with AI, with a lot of these technologies. So create partnerships with universities and other centers so that they get access to these technologies. And lastly, we have to remember that people are going to be hurt by this, or some people are going to be hurt, others are going to benefit. So we have to have the policies in place that are also going to help those that are going to be hurt so that everyone can benefit.
Thank you. So if nothing else, this pandemic has raised the importance of the government's role, the role to step in and manage the economy and provide social safety nets during these challenging times. For example, here in Canada, last week's throne speech was really about an expanded vision for the federal government's role in the lives of Canadians. Similarly, I suspect the upcoming presidential election in the US will also be about competing visions of the role of the state. So Tony, over to you in Washington first. What should governments be doing right now to help prepare for this challenge right now during the pandemic?
Well, I think one very important thing they can do is build into any pandemic relief packages additional training for those who are at home now, those who might come back to work but might not get back to work if they don't have additional skills. There are existing frameworks in most countries, including the United States, in which you could do that. And so that's something I think everybody can start doing. Then you start building on that to change these programs, many of which fall short of the needs. But the very short need is help people who are at home now, keep them from going out of the workforce, allow them to come back into the jobs. And sometimes they just need pretty elementary digital skills. But over the longer term, they're going to need more sophisticated skills to get back to these jobs that Joel was talking about. When you get jobs that reflect AI and new automation, you need to have a higher level skills. So you probably need a longer training. You have to have models that have perpetual regular training built into a career. And small and medium enterprises aren't going to have the money to do that. So you are going to need public programs that can help them do that. Bigger companies are going to do that, but they probably don't want to carry the whole bill themselves, and they think this should be a partnership also. And there's argument to that. So you need to work on these partnerships. It's really important to remember that one of the big things government can do is deal with the data. They collect data from across all the national economy. And in most countries, they don't produce good data and get it out quickly, so people don't know what the skills are that are evolving. And that includes academic institutions. Academic institutions need to be plugged into this, and they need to change the way they operate too. Let's be really clear about this. Universities, community colleges, everybody has to change. And that means changing the way you're teaching your courses, the way you're preparing those students to go out there. You need to know what skills those kids are going to need when they get into the market. Governments can help you figure that out. Partnerships with your local government, your local businesses can help define that. That doesn't mean eliminating general education and other things that are really important, but it means honing what you're preparing your students to be able to do when they get out there looking for jobs.
Thank you. Toshiko, how should Asian governments respond to this? Not just governments, but civil society as well.
Yes, I agree that government's role have expanded and citizens seek official support from the government. But on the other side, the pandemic clearly shows us that migrant workers in a very much vulnerable position in the way that they have often been excluded from the emergency benefit payment from the government. And besides, citizens in the host country tend to be chauvinistic to migrant workers, taking advantage of the government's strict regulation of people's entry at the borders. But on the other hand, the crisis has revealed how much we had depended on migrant labor to the level that we cannot imagine any day without their labor to make our society in a subsistence function. And let me introduce you to one vivid example. For the last few months, the prices of vegetables and fruits are remarkably soaring in Japan, and I can see the same phenomenon in South Korea and other countries. And the restriction of movement and quarantine life increased the demand for food and daily necessity, which disrupted the circulation of commodities and pressured food prices. But another critical reason for the rise of food prices is the ban of entry of new foreign technical intern trainees who were supposed to take farming jobs in rural Japan. So as the episode indicates, we can sense that after effects of the COVID, how much our lives are threatened by the interrupted global flows of people and goods. In some, governments and civil society, especially in host country, must face the reality that the international labor migration programs employed hitherto will no longer be sustainable at a time of global crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Tom, what do we owe those left unemployed by the pandemic? And is this different? Should it be different to what we owe those who were already unemployed before the pandemic?
Yeah, so one way to think about this question is at the level of policy design. Are there kinds of measures that are the kinds of measures that we usually use to improve employment prospects suitable in the case of this pandemic? And to answer that question, we need to know more about the nature of the employment crisis and the extent to which we should expect long-term structural changes of the kind that Joel has talked about. But I want to just highlight another dimension to the question. What's striking to me is that we've seen an outpouring of support for those who have lost their jobs because of this pandemic. Across the world, we've seen the introduction of a raft of measures whose purpose is to lessen the burdens and to get people back into work. Now, we might have reservations about the efficiency of this, but the huge sums of money that governments are spending on this reveal something important. Now, this kind of generosity is justifiable, I think, probably morally required. But I suspect that this kind of generosity is in fact required in a much larger range of cases than is standardly thought. We should worry about the employment prospects not only of those who've lost their jobs due to COVID, but also those who are struggling to find gainful employment for a raft of reasons. Those who didn't enjoy a fair start in life, who received a substandard education, or those who live in areas of industrial decline, perhaps due to globalization or automation.
Great. Joel, over to you. What role can government play in ensuring that all citizens benefit from this transformation?
Yeah, so as we've been discussing, some are going to benefit, some are not going to benefit, are going to be hurt. And so the first question, so one of the first roles of government is going to be to do some kind of redistribution. And obviously, in order to do that, you need to be able to tax those individuals that are really going to benefit from these oncoming changes. Now, the reality is that, our intangibles are playing a bigger and bigger role in production. So things like algorithms, data, IP, and those tend to be notoriously difficult to tax because you can take those three things, you can set them up in the Cayman Islands, and it's not exactly easy to tax. And if those are going to generate more and more of the wealth in our society, we're going to have a bit of a problem. So I'd say step number one, and this is exactly what I said to the OECD, to the G7, et cetera. Step number one is we need to broaden the tax base, and this needs to be done multilaterally because no one country can do it on their own. Now, once we've done that, now we can start talking about supporting people that are going to be hurt through this. And the first part of the support is exactly what Tony was saying. We need to start retraining people. We need to be upskilling people, but we also need to be thinking about things like a guaranteed minimum income or a guaranteed basic income. Now, I see, and to go to echo what Tom was just saying, I think we have a tremendous historical opportunity before us. And that is stemming from the fact that, so an opportunity to reinvent a social safety net. So we have a level of solidarity that in society that we have not seen for generations. And we also have an increased belief in the role of government. Again, something that has not happened in a really long time. And so we have a historic opportunity now to reimagine our social contract, the social safety nets, not just to help people through this one particular crisis, but for future crises as well.
Thank you. I just want to take some questions from the audience now. Tony, let's try this one on you about the resurgence of protectionist economic policy for the recovery. Does it imply the failure of free markets in the past, do you think?
I think it sadly reflects a response to people blaming others for problems. And there's a lot of blame to go around, but in most cases, there's a lot of blame at home as well as some overseas. And for example, as I've looked back at the job losses in the United States for the first 15 years of this century, you can really see it as the result of, yes, increased competition, but two, bad public policy responding to that increase in competition. We did not use the policy tools, and the ones that we had were insufficient to help people adjust to what is the result of competition. You lose some jobs, you gain some others. Some industries decline, some increase. In North America, for example, there was this great criticism that all these jobs were being lost to Mexico. Well, if you look at the real facts, there are 7 times more jobs in the United States supported by trade with Mexico than there were when NAFTA started. Those jobs are different, however. People where a tire factory moved south did not find new jobs. The new jobs were in Arizona or Texas, and they were doing something that required more skills. And that's where public policy is really important. Same thing we're talking about, all of us here, the kind of policy that gives people and communities new opportunities to make those adjustments. And so that is another historic opportunity to build in at this time. And in that sense, I think everybody has to think about a broad competitiveness agenda. What's going to make your economy as a nation more competitive? And part of it may be taking care of the least capable in your society, part of it, but part of it's going to be more research and development, better universities, better infrastructure, better training, the kind of support that's needed when trade or competition moves things around, because this happens within countries too. If you look at the United States, how many jobs shifted from one part of the United States to another? Many. And people were just left behind. So we need to reflect on all these lessons and not respond in a way of just blame the others for things that went wrong. I don't mean to say that if countries were unfairly trading and using unfair practices, we shouldn't address those. We definitely should address those, but that's just part of the response.
Thank you very much. Joel, questions coming in concerning what you said on polarization. Does work polarization lead to smaller, more inclusive communities that shop and work in a more local way? Or have those types of localized economies, in your view, disappeared forever?
So I guess I don't know if the question is referring to job polarization versus sort of the globalization. I see those as
work polarization. Work polarization.
Work polarization. Again, I don't know exactly what that means, but
okay, we'll go for job polarization.
Yeah. So I'm assuming that means, you know, that over the last 30, 40 years, we have seen a decrease in the number of jobs towards the middle of the skill distribution and the middle of the wage distribution. And so, I mean, that's been one big trend, largely driven by technology. It has also, I mean, the other reason why that has happened, of course, is globalization, because a lot of these jobs have moved overseas because they can be, like manufacturing jobs, whereas some of the lower end jobs, like a lot of service jobs, cannot physically be moved overseas. Now, do I see that we can move to a localized economy? Absolutely not. I mean, I think we've moved to a globalized world. I don't think there's any going back. I think if we tried to go back, there would be a tremendous cost to everyone involved, much like Tony was saying. And so it's a matter of recognizing that in this globalized world, there's some costs, but there's also lots of benefits. And we have to try and be as productive, as competitive as possible to increase these benefits.
Thank you. Questions also coming in on the impact of all of this on mental health, something which is under debate in most of the countries that, certainly the ones that we come from. So Tom Parr, I'd like to ask you, will COVID, in your view, result in a significant mental health crisis due to platforms like Zoom, Teams, etc.? And might this ultimately lead to new forms of economic crises, like lack of productivity, lack of creativity, etc.? Or will this be balanced out by automation and creative solutions?
Yeah, these are really tricky questions, and we're waiting to find out more as the pandemic unfolds. One of the interesting aspects is to do, as you noted, to do with mental health. So we know that because of the economic consequences of the pandemic, as well as the health risks, of course, we should expect some very severe, perhaps even disastrous consequences for mental health, at least in the short run. In the longer term, it's difficult to predict, I think. So I've spoken a little bit about remote working and working from home and how that might exacerbate social isolation, the fact that we're not going to have such sustained face-to-face contact. But of course, that might be evened out in other ways. So if the additional free time that we enjoy through not having to commute, for example, is time that we spend with our friends or with our children, then it could well be that those beneficial consequences even out some of the negative ones. So the net effect for mental health, I think, can be difficult to predict in the long run. And of course, policy is going to play an ineliminable role here.
Thank you. Toshiko, just on international labor migration, can you comment? There are some questions coming in on how international labor relates, or how you see the impact in international labor as it relates to education, research, and intellectual work, where the tasks can technically be completed more remotely, but where government policies require the physical presence in the host country. Can you comment on this?
Yes, thank you. I don't have immediate answer to the question yet, but I can say that before the pandemic, highly educated migrant workers have been valued and sought after by many countries because to increase the competition among the countries. But I think I have answered to the question before that we have to expect the tremendous like paradigm shift of the international migration, which means that our concept of essential worker or our concept of skilled and unskilled labor might be changed tremendously because before the pandemic, maybe medical workers, healthcare workers have been sought after occupation by the migrant workers, but maybe so-called highly skilled and very professional migrant workers may not be sought after job, not so much after the COVID-19. I do not know the exact reason for that, but maybe I can say that we have to think about the tremendous change or tremendous structural change of the international labor migration after the COVID.
Thank you very much. Joel Blitt, questions coming in on artificial intelligence and asking what sense is competition as a paradigm still useful in a future of AI and extensive robotics, essentially? And does AI benefit monopolies and scale over competition?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and certainly something we need to worry about. We have seen, we can talk about the platforms and their monopolies, and it is something that we really need to be cognizant of and worried about. A couple of things to keep in mind. Whenever there's a new technology, initially there's going to be a few first movers that are going to almost corner the market, right? They're going to be out front. And to some extent, that's what we're seeing on AI right now. Eventually, it becomes more commoditized, more mainstream, and then everyone's going to start using AI, a lot more firms, et cetera. So from that perspective, we should be less worried about monopolization of the technology going forward. Having said that, there are key assets that are complementary to AI, and in particular, I'm talking about data, right? So in order to be able to effectively deploy AI, you need lots of data, and there certainly is hoarding of data going on, and certain companies are, because of their operations, in great positions to create more of this data, develop better algorithms through AI again, and therefore grow their platform even more. And so you can see these sort of positive feedbacks where it could lead to a natural monopoly in certain sectors. And so at some point we are going to have to think about, well, do we force these firms to share the data, right? And the other thing about data is it's a public good. And a public good is going to generate the biggest surplus for society if everyone can access it. And so I think there is a role for government and for academics and others to think about data and how it should be governed in the future. To avoid, to ensure we have competition and to avoid monopoly type settings.
Thank you very much. Toshiko, last question, please. What would you think might be the impact of the pandemic on implementing the UN Global Compact on migration?
Thank you very much. I think that because the migrant workers has been taken for granted by many host countries before the pandemic, but we have realized that how much they were essential in our society. So maybe we have to strengthen the inclusive approach to migrant workers. And then maybe we have to focus on the more social benefit and the social security of migrant worker should be maybe strengthened in the global compact too.
Thank you so much. Panelists, there are lots of policymakers in the audience today. I'd just like to do a quick tour de table and ask you for your #1 top tip that you would like to leave with the policy world on this subject. So we'll start with you, Tony.
Don't forget the workers. Workers are an important part of your ability to be competitiveness, to have a healthy economy. You need to invest in them. You need to have the policy framework that allows them to be as capable as they can be as you go forward. And it's a really important part of having an overall competitiveness agenda in a country.
Great point. Bring the people with you. Those competency frameworks and matrices in the future might look very different. Tom, your top tip.
So the crucial thing, I think, is not to focus on the aggregate effects of the pandemic alone, but to focus on the distribution of those effects. The fact that there's going to be winners and losers. My concern is that without concerted efforts from policymakers, the likelihood is that the worst losses will be suffered by those at the bottom, by society's least advantaged members. But it's their prospects that it's most important to improve, and so morally imperative that when thinking about the pandemic, we do so with their interests in mind.
Thank you very much. Toshiko Sujimoto, please share your top tip.
I think I have mentioned earlier to consider new normal life, which is immune to global crisis. We need to consider an inclusive approach to migrant workers, like we have to think about their citizenship and social and biological production as well, so that we can address the future work and the construction of the new normal should be also address the migrants' productive and reproductive life as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Joel Blitt, finish us off. What would you leave with the policy community?
So I'm going to cheat. I'm going to give one to Canadian policymakers and then one to world ones. So for Canadian ones, I think the obvious one is we need to start shifting away from the wage subsidies. It is stifling innovation. It's stifling automation. It is costing a huge amount of money. So support workers, not firms through these wage subsidies. And for the world community, we really need to get on top of broadening taxation in a multilateral way before things get completely out of hand. So once there's this massive increased inequality around the world, it'll be that much harder to tax the very rich. And so it's urgent. We need to do that now. And we need to do it multilaterally.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists. I'm sure everybody will agree in the audience that was a really stimulating, compelling, and timely discussion. Thank you, audience, for joining us. We hope you'll tune in next week. Same time, same place, same link for an equally interesting discussion, particularly as we talk about the future of the Sustainable Development Goals on the title of Global Resources, Scarcity, Sustainability, and Security. Until then, thank you, take care, and stay safe.